Okay, welcome everyone to this series of Pufendorf lectures. This year, I have a pleasure to introduce Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a professor of psychology at Northeastern University in Boston, among other things. To the general public, she's probably most well known for her books, How Emotions Are Made, and 7.5 lessons about the brain. She also written a lot of interesting papers that I know many of us have read and like. And if you haven't, then you get a chance now to hear it, about it anyway. Popular papers apparently, since I was looking at Google Scholar, and you're close to 100,000 citations, so we can all be envious about that. So now for 3 days here, we'll have 3 lectures. Today it's about creating emotions. Tomorrow we'll talk about creating the mind. And then on Wednesday, relational realism, which I assume will be slightly more philosophical. With that, I'll give a word to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today, to have a chance to talk with you. So I very much appreciate the invitation to give these public lectures. Today, I'm going to start a series of 3 lectures that really will span the 30 years of work in my laboratory and work with many, many students and many, many collaborators. So I just want to set some of the ground rules for today. So these are public lectures, but they're public lectures at a university. And so what that means is these are not very data-heavy lectures, meaning I'm going to be using images and maybe illustrative studies to make a point about an entire literature here and there. But so there will be a little bit of data, and I definitely have to show you some brain images because I am a neuroscientist, and I will be kicked out of the neuroscience club if I don't show you at least one image of a brain. But if for those of you who are have a scholarly interest, a serious scholarly interest in any of this work, I'm happy. Usually we'll put references on the slide, and I'm also happy to share additional references with you. So what I'm really attempting to do is to give you the arc of the 30 years of work that we've done and where we've ended up, which is in the lab, which is investigating some basic aspects of brain function and what they mean for our notions of reality. But today we're starting with where I started, which is the nature of emotion. And as I talk today, I'm going to start by thanking all the funding agencies that have supported the work over the years. But more importantly, I need to show you multiple generations of my lab. This is who we are today, in part because all of the work I'm going to show you was actually conducted by these brilliant young scientists, some of whom now are full professors and have their own labs. So, so I really owe a lot to them, and I just want to dispel the great man view of science, okay? I'm up here, I'm talking to you, I'm the front man for a huge group of people. Long ago, people believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, and at one time people also believed that the Earth was flat. These beliefs were rooted in our everyday experience of the world. And now we know they're mistaken thanks to many, many scientific advances. And so what I'm going to suggest to you today is that many beliefs about emotion also began with our own experiences of emotion, and that many of these beliefs are mistaken now that we have a number of scientific advances, some of which I'm going to talk to you about today. So in this first lecture, we'll consider 3 mistaken beliefs about the nature of emotion, as well as the evidence that corrects them as a starting point for a more justified theory of emotion. And this theory will ultimately lead us towards a theory of the mind, with its neuroscience, cultural, and philosophical underpinnings, and that's what we'll get to tomorrow and Wednesday. So here's the first mistaken belief, that emotions are displayed on the face with universal expressions that we all recognize. People around the world are supposed to smile in happiness, frown in sadness, scowl in anger. Everyone around the world is supposed to be able to recognize these facial movements as emotions. This is a belief that has been around really in the psychology of emotion, I would say, for probably a century. And the evidence just doesn't support it. So here are the facial movements that are assumed to universally express emotion in several of the most common categories that are studied. And so one question we can ask is, how often do people actually make these expressions in the moments they're expected? So how often do people smile in happiness? How often do they scowl in anger? And so on. And it turns out that the answer is not so much. So this is just one study that was conducted by Linda Camras and her lab. What they did was they videotaped 7 to 9-year-old US children who, while they were having discussions with their mothers. And as you can see, the kids did not make the expected expressions the majority of the time. So only 10% of the time when the kids were angry did they scowl, for example. Only 25% of the time did they widen their eyes and gasp in fear. Some of these numbers are significantly greater than what you would expect by chance, but they're certainly not what you would expect if these expressions are universal. This is just one culture, with kids from one culture. That study, though, matches evidence that's been statistically summarized from dozens of studies with thousands of participants, called a meta-analysis. So, for example, in this recent meta-analysis, in anger, people scowled about 35% of the time. So that's greater than chance, and it's good enough to get you a good publication. I heard 1 or 2 chuckles. So I don't know how things work here, but the way I like to do things is I tell bad jokes. You laugh to provide me with encouragement. Good. Okay, so everything is going to go really smoothly now that we all know. So 35% of the time is better than chance, but it's not most of the time, right? And I want you to consider what this means. It means 65% of the time when people are angry, they're not scowling. They're doing something else that's meaningful with their face. So think about the way you express anger across various instances and occasions in your life. I know for myself, I rarely scowl in anger. I might smile in anger. I might laugh in anger. I might sit quietly and plot the demise of my enemy in anger. I might cry in anger. I do all of those things. If you assumed that scowling equaled anger, you would be missing 65% of the instances where people are angry. And about 50% of the time, scowling means something other than anger. So when people scowl, only about 50% of the time they're angry, which means that if you equated scowling with anger, you would actually be wrong. 50% of the time, you would be assuming somebody was angry when in fact they were experiencing something else. People scowl when they're concentrating really hard. My husband, who's very generously joined me here today, makes a full facial scowl when he's concentrating really hard. And just so we're clear, I have been studying this stuff for 30 years. I still sometimes will look at him and say, is everything okay? Like, are you? And he's like, who are you? And what have you done with my wife? You know, it's very, these ideas are very ingrained, but they're wrong, right? And those numbers work pretty much for every emotion category that's ever been studied. So 62% of the time when people wrinkle their nose, they're not disgusted. And 52% of the time when people widen their eyes and gasp, they are not afraid. Now, these numbers, I think, are important because they represent how people actually move their faces in real life. I want you to compare these numbers to hundreds of studies where test subjects like us have been shown faces like these posed to portray the presumed universal expressions. And then participants are given a small set of emotion words, and they have to pick the word that they think describes the face. And usually these studies are done using English categories and translations of English words. And here, this is a meta-analysis, the last meta-analysis, the last statistical summary of studies that was published. So in these experiences, people are responding as if they believe that they are detecting emotion in these faces. And I want you to just look at the discrepancy. So people believe that these faces express the emotion that they are purported to express much more frequently than people actually use those faces to express emotion. Now, all of these studies were conducted in large urban cultures, samples from large urban cultures that have routine exposure to Western cultural practices and norms. It's widely considered the case that the strongest test of universal emotion requires studying individuals in small-scale cultures who are relatively more isolated from Western cultural practices. And here I'm really emphasizing relatively more isolated, because no culture at this point is isolated from Western influence. For almost 40 years, claims of universality were based on a handful of studies that you see in gray here, that were reported in just 2 peer-reviewed papers. For 40 years, every claim you ever read in a textbook, in a paper, were based on these samples that came from one part of the world in 2 peer-reviewed publications. Since then, there have been almost a dozen studies since 2008 with renewed interest in this question, using a wider range of empirical methods, testing a greater number of cultures, and the majority of these studies find substantial variation in the way that people perceive emotion across cultures. And our lab actually contributed papers related to the testing of 2 cultures. One in the Himba culture in northwestern Namibia, rural Namibia, and the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. I recently summarized these and other studies with 4 senior scientists. We all started with highly diverse views on the nature of emotion and the question of whether or not expressions are universal. And I just want to, for a minute, call out these guys, because they were an amazing team of people to work with. So you have to imagine there are 5 of us. Some of us have never met before. We all come into this project disagreeing with each other. And we're not sure we're actually going to reach consensus, because no one has reached consensus. This is a really contentious issue still. So we set up all these contingencies for what we were going to do if we couldn't come to consensus. Were we going to publish one paper where we had different voices? Were we going to publish 2 papers, one being a rebuttal of the other? Like, what were we going to do so that we didn't waste the 2.5 years that ultimately it took us over Zoom, this was pre-COVID, to read and discuss 1,000 papers and summarize them into a single narrative? And I think we surprised ourselves that we actually did come to consensus. And I'm happy to talk more about this process if you'd like. In my experience, this was probably one of the best scientific experiences I ever had in my life, actually, was working with these guys. But what I'm going to do now is just summarize our conclusions with an example. So I want you to take a look at this person. How does she feel? Can someone tell me what do you think? What do you think she's feeling right now? Sleepy? Just call it out. Sad. Calm. Who said happy? You have to leave. Or you get candy at the end. Isn't that what, that's what you guys like, candy? Yeah. What's that? You take your chances, okay. Well, people usually see this person as sad or tired or grieving. Actually, this is my daughter, Sophia, at the Chocolate Museum in Cologne, Germany from a couple of years ago. I can assure you that she was experiencing a profound, deep sense of pleasure. She is on her second chocolate drink. And this little sweetie is also feeling pleasure. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is that people move their faces in many different ways during instances of the same emotion. Because facial movements, like all movements, are contextually constrained. They are determined by the context. Now, when we just look at this little guy's eyebrows, his eyebrows are actually part of the expected universal expression for anger. And in fact, this face is often seen as angry. But this is a photograph of a US politician named Jim Webb, who in 2006 was elected to the US Senate for the state of Virginia. Now, you guys aren't Americans, so you won't, maybe, I'll just tell you the significance of this photograph. This guy, when he won this election, he returned the U.S. Congress to the House of Representatives, oh no, the Senate, the U.S. Senate, to the Democrats. So he's super happy, as were many of his colleagues. But without context, people see his face as expressing anger because, in fact, this face often symbolizes anger in our culture. This image was created with generative AI. I prompted it to show me a person who was expressing anger. So people not only move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion, they also move their faces in exactly the same way during instances of different emotions. And just as a case in point, last year I saw this face on X, previously known as Twitter. Someone fed it to an emotion AI program which determined with a very high degree of confidence that this guy was expressing anger. But take a look. Right, so this is a beautiful illustration of what happens when you train AI on beliefs that are not backed up by sound scientific evidence. So when it comes to emotion, a face does not speak for itself. Instead, variation is the norm. It's not random what people do with their faces, it's situated. When you see emotion in another person's face, it feels to you like you're reading that person's emotion, but you're not. Your brain is actually guessing what those facial movements mean in the larger context. And because the reason why it feels given, like you're detecting emotion or that they're displaying emotion, is that your guessing is occurring very automatically with very little awareness on your part. So what is up with these expressions? Where did they come from? Well, I can tell you one thing. They were not discovered by observing how people actually move their faces in everyday life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists who then built a whole science around them for 30, 40 years. But they're basically stereotypes. They're Western stereotypes. And who was the first scientist who enshrined these particular movements as universal? Does anybody know? It wasn't Tompkins. He was part of the I would say the first generation of scientists to build the science. Darwin. That's right. It was Charles Darwin. Okay, so in his book on the expression of the emotion in man and animals, Darwin wrote that emotional expressions emerged via Lamarckian evolution, not by natural selection, and now they were no longer of any use. So Darwin actually did not think that facial expressions were useful. He thought they were vestigial, kind of like your tailbone. And I think my point here is I'm not trying to point this out to have a gotcha moment with Charles Darwin, right? Every great scientist is wrong about something, right? Charles Darwin also wrote about, On the Origin of Species, he wrote about gemmules as little particles that convey heredity. You probably, who here knows about gemmules or have heard about gemmules? 1, 2, awesome. But most of you haven't, because most of you are not historians, and science did its job. Scientists did their job, right? You don't hear about it because in the end, that was not a very good idea. So the point that I'm making here is that it's really important to remember that Darwin, like everyone, is writing in a historical context, and we have to take what he said in that historical context. He wrote this book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Originally, it was the last chapter in The Descent of Man, and then he peeled it off and published it as a separate book as evidence that natural selection occurs in humans, right? So the point he was making was, these expressions are around and they're not of any use. They're vestigial, but yet they're still here. That's how we know humans evolved from earlier animals. So if we, instead of starting with authority, the authority of Darwin, we instead start with the evidence, then what we see is tremendous variation structured by context. And so here's the working hypothesis. The raise of an eyebrow, the curl of a lip, the tilt of a head, these movements are physical signals. Signal is just a quantity of something that changes in magnitude. Physical signals take on different emotional meaning in different contexts. So on their own, physical signals have no inherent emotional meaning. Instead, a brain has to make these signals meaningful in a larger ensemble of signals. And this hypothesis, which I'm introducing today, is going to be a theme that runs through all 3 lectures this week. When you look at someone's face, your brain is taking in a whole ensemble of signals from the surrounding context. And some of that context you carry with you. It's called your body, that your brain is attached to. And what your brain is doing is it's knitting together all these signals with its own electrical and chemical signals to create emotional meaning. So emotional meaning is relational. It's created from an ensemble of signals, some of which only exist in your head. And this is how you can experience the same scowling face as an expression of anger, or an expression of concentration, or maybe just somebody suffering from a bad bout of intestinal gas. Thank you. You're awesome. You're laughing very loudly. I can see you're a reliable guy for laughing at my really bad jokes, so I appreciate that. So here's mistake number 2. It's pretty much the same as mistake number 1. This is the idea that emotions live in your body, each with its own dedicated universal pattern of physical changes. So your heart, it's supposed to race in fear. Your blood pressure, it's supposed to go up in anger, and so on. And again, I'm going to use one example to summarize an entire field of work, including a meta-analysis, a statistical summary that our lab published in 2018. I'm summarizing the findings of more than 200 studies with more than 20,000 participants. So this is just to illustrate examples of all of the occasions when a person can be happy. So think about all the occasions in which you're happy. You're probably making very different physical movements depending on the situation. And it turns out that those physical movements are supported by movements inside your body, by changes in heart rate, changes in breathing, changes in hormone levels, and so on. So if your physical movements vary across situations on different occasions for happiness, so will the movements inside your body vary. And so here too, just like with faces, variation is the norm. The variation isn't random. It's structured by the situation, by what you are attempting to do in that particular situation. And it's also the case that the same physical signal can have different emotional meanings in different situations. So let's say your heart is pounding in your chest, it's racing. A racing heart at a doctor's office can be an experience of anxiety or dread. That exact same racing heart can be part of excitement on a successful dinner date. Remind me to tell you about the time when I went on a date with someone and had a racing heart and, you know, felt flushed and was having trouble concentrating and was experiencing myself as really attracted to this guy when it turned out really I was developing the flu. But the point is that in the moment, it's not that I was mistaken. My brain was interpreting those signals and creating an experience of something that then led me to continue dating that guy for 9 months. And it was a big mistake. Also, a racing heart could be determination when you're taking an exam or, say, giving an invited lecture in a named lecture series that's prestigious in front of people you don't know, when you're begging them to laugh at your jokes and you're not sure if it's working or if you're dying up here. So, right, a racing heart can mean many things. The American psychologist and philosopher William James wrote about this variation more than 100 years ago. It actually formed the cornerstone of his ideas about emotion and consciousness more generally. He wrote that each emotion has a distinct bodily state. Now, James, with this idea, was saying that every instance of emotion has a distinct bodily state. For example, he wrote, fear of getting wet is not the same fear as fear of a bear. So instances of fear vary in their physical manifestations. He also wrote, surely there is no definite affectation of anger in an entative sense. Right? So actually what James is, it's important what he's saying, because what he's saying is that an emotion like fear or like anger is a category full of variety. And the feeling, what it feels like to be angry or what it feels like to be afraid, depends on the physical manifestation in that moment. The thing is that James is widely quoted as saying the exact opposite of this. James is quoted as saying that each category of emotion, fear or anger, has its own distinct bodily state. So he's being quoted really in hundreds of papers and almost every introductory textbook in psychology for saying the opposite of what he actually said. How many of you here have heard of the James Lange theory of emotion? Yeah, the James Lange theory of emotion is a disaster, of a disastrous misreading of James. Lange believed that every category had an essence, a physical essence, what he called a vasomotor essence. So, you know, your body did one thing in fear, one thing in anger. William James disagreed with Lange, and it's actually right in the notes of his paper. So it's a really interesting story how this fiction, the James Lange theory, got to be a thing in a piece of justified knowledge in psychology when, in fact, it's a gross misquoting of William James. And you know, this is a whole other lecture on its own, but I will say that this misreading of James has survived for more than 100 years, and there are many, many, many scientific errors that are based on this misreading. I have so much more to say about that, but I hope you can see me regulating as I'm trying to move on, because I just think it's just fascinating and an important point about how science works. In any case, again, a racing heart, a gush of hormones like cortisol, a squirt of dopamine or any other neurochemical, these are physical signals that are biologically present, but they have no inherent emotional meaning. The meaning is not in the signal itself. These signals are constantly streaming to your brain from your body or are present in your body. So dopamine, for example, is actually all over your body, not just in your brain. Ditto for cortisol. And as they signals stream to your brain is making them meaningful as emotions. So again, emotional meaning is relational. The physical changes inside your body become meaningful as an instance of emotion in a larger ensemble of signals. And some of those signals only exist in a brain. So emotions don't live in your body. They are constructed in your brain. As your brain makes bodily changes emotionally meaningful. So here's the third mistaken belief about emotion that we'll discuss today, and this is the idea that the brain contains dedicated emotion circuits. So emotions, I don't have to tell you this, I mean, I think you know, emotions feel like they just happen to you. That they just, you know, they're triggered by events in the world, they bubble up, hijacking your behavior, making it difficult to do and say the right thing, causing us to behave in ways maybe we would rather not. And these experiences, what it feels like to be in an episode of emotion, has led to the mistaken belief that our brains are pre-wired with emotions from birth. That we all share the same emotion circuits buried deep inside some animalistic part of our brain. And not only that, but we probably share these with other animals. And depending on who you read, it could be other primates or other mammals, or maybe all other vertebrates, or maybe all other animals, period. But experiences of emotion, no matter how compelling they are, don't reveal the brain's inner workings. And I just want to say here that it's normative in science to start with your experience of the world, right? I mean, when Aristotle wrote, you know, millennia ago, you know, he was writing about the basic elements of the world as, you know, water, you know, air, and so on and so forth, what he could experience, right? Every science starts with human experience and then abstracts away from that experience. So psychology and neuroscience are not different in that regard. It's just that we still assume that our experiences of emotion reveal to us that emotions must be inborn and pre-wired at birth, or we experience thoughts as different from feelings, and so we assume that therefore there must be thoughts and feelings must exist in different parts of the brain, or in different networks of the brain. And I guess the larger point to make here is that your experiences have to be explained by a science of the brain, but they don't reveal to you how the brain, your experiences don't reveal how your brain works. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you a couple of findings to make my point about emotion. And we're going to focus on a region, kind of like the rock star, you know, of the science of emotion, which is a subcortical area called the amygdala. So how many of you have heard of the amygdala? Yeah. The amygdala is like, I mean, any popular science story that's writing about emotion or fear stars the amygdala. So here I'm showing you a brain image. So as promised, this is the first one. And what you're looking at here is a slice of the brain where what I've done is it's as if I've sliced down the midsection and kind of popped the front off, right? So if you were looking in the mirror and you just popped the front of your face off and then you cleaned away all the blood, that's what you would see. There's one amygdala on one side and there's another on the other side. So everyone has two. Neurotypical brains have two. For decades, scientists believed that that the amygdala was the home of fear or the home of emotion more generally. And in fact, this is still a very, very common belief, even amongst scientists. But there is a mountain of evidence to show that this is not the case. My lab put this claim to the test more than a decade ago. We statistically summarized hundreds of studies in which people were experiencing emotion while having their brains scanned. And what I'm showing you here along the horizontal axis are the proportion of studies that we analyzed that reported an increase in amygdala activity. And I'm going to say that when I refer to activity here, what this really means, what we're really measuring in brain imaging is an increase in the oxygen concentration levels in the blood around this area, which scientists call the BOLD signal, or blood oxygen level dependent signal. So I'm actually going to refer to changes in BOLD signal. I'm not going to refer to neural activity or brain activity, because we just published a paper recently which calls into question whether the BOLD signal is actually indexing generically brain activity. So I'm just going to refer to changes in the signal without the theory-laden interpretation for now. And I'm happy to explain more about that in the question and answer, but again, that's a whole other new talk. So indeed, when we look at all the studies that had been published at that time, about 30% of them showed an increase in BOLD signal in the amygdala. Now, 30% is greater than what you would expect by chance, but it's not large enough, not frequent enough to be evidence that that the amygdala contains the neural circuitry for fear. And also, BOLD signal increased in the amygdala, not just during instances of fear, but it actually, BOLD signal increases were observed in basically every other emotion category that's ever been studied. And also in many, 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 many experiments that have nothing to do with emotion. So if I just show you a novel image that you've never seen before, it could be completely neutral, but as long as it's novel, and I show it to you, and I measure, let's say I was scanning your brain while we were doing it, what we would see is a massive change in amygdala, in BOLD signal in the amygdala, just in response to novelty. And we've in fact published those findings, and other people have replicated them. And in fact, one of the reasons why 60% of the studies of disgust, when people are experiencing disgust, the reason why you see so much change in BOLD signal, or so frequent change in BOLD signal during disgust, is that when we are attempting to cultivate disgust in people, we're showing them images they would never look at, they've never seen before, and they would never ever look at. And here's just another interesting tidbit to make this point. The original experiments that were done on fear would have participants view wide-eyed gasping faces, the stereotype for the expression of fear. And almost instantly, you would see this massive change in BOLD signal in the amygdala. And so scientists put this together and thought, well, this is consistent evidence that, fear has something to do with the amygdala. But what they didn't tell you is that that signal habituates really fast. You only see it in the first couple of trials where you're showing people these wide-eyed gasping phases, and then you fail to see it for the rest of the experiment. And later it was discovered that most people have never seen that wide-eyed gasping phase. Most people look at it and they don't know what it is. And in fact, partly how I got into this business and studying emotion in the first place was that I tried to use those faces, wide-eyed gasping faces, in an experiment, and it completely failed because subjects had no clue what they were looking at. And if you test subjects, if you talk to people who've never taken a psychology class, they have no idea what they're looking at. But these faces are really unusual and novel to us. So that's partly why, you would immediately see this large change in bold signal in the amygdala, and then it would habituate really quickly. So this pattern of findings holds really for every brain region that's ever been claimed to be the location of fear or of an emotion. So your insula, which is another part of your brain, which is supposed to be specific and contain the circuitry for disgust. The insula is actually a huge swath of tissue, which shows increases in bold signal for all kinds of phenomena, and so on and so forth. Here's another example. This is an example where scientists place electrodes in the brains of live patients, human patients waiting for brain surgery. And so what you're looking at here is an image where the brain is sliced this way and we've popped off the top, and you're looking down into the brain, and the arrows are where the depth electrodes were placed, or at least in the amygdala. They were actually placed all over the brain. These experiments show that, or I should say, in these experiments, patients were shown images of snakes and spiders and other threatening objects, and then the scientists recorded electrical activity directly from amygdala neurons. And what these recordings make really clear is that amygdala neurons increase their firing rate 300 to 600 milliseconds after the onset of the images, and only after certain areas of the cerebral cortex already had increased their firing. This is too slow for amygdala neurons to be the key players in a fear-related response that could actually keep you alive in a moment of threat. Or consider these identical twins. The technical term is monozygotic twins. So these twins share 100% of genetic material. They were born with exactly the same disease that destroyed both amygdala, most of both amygdala when they were preteens. One sister, BG, has difficulty experiencing and perceiving fear. She can experience fear and she can perceive fear, but only under really extreme circumstances. For the most part, everyday experiences of fear and she doesn't have, and she also has difficulty perceiving fear in other people. Her sister has no trouble where fear is concerned. And brain imaging evidence from these sisters indicates that, a human brain can create fear in multiple ways, with or without an amygdala. In biology, this is called degeneracy. In neuroscience, we call it multiple realizability. Basically, there's more than one way for the brain to create a phenomenon, exactly the same phenomenon. Scientists have also looked for fear circuitry beyond the amygdala. So here I'm showing you the bold signal results from 3 different studies in which people were experiencing fear as they had their brains scanned. Each study used supervised machine learning to find the pattern that was specific to fear, instances of fear. And as you can see, each study found a different pattern. So here too, variation is the norm. Now, if you were expecting a single pattern, something like a biomarker for fear, you would look at this and you would say, well, this is a failure to replicate. But this is not a failure to replicate. This is, again, evidence that the human brain can create fear in multiple ways. Now, in each of these studies, the goal was to find a single brain pattern, a single pattern for all instances of fear. That's the way the studies were designed. But what happens if you assume instead that the brain can make fear in many ways? What if you design your experiment differently and you go looking for structured variation if it's there? You could still discover the sameness if there's sameness across instances, but you could also discover variation if it's there and actually model that variation. And so that is what my colleague HT-fakulteterna did. What he did with his lab is he sampled the experience of fear during 3 types of situations to examine whether there was a single bold pattern across all instances of fear or whether there were different patterns. So they used part of their data. So subjects would look at images, they would experience fear, they would make a rating, and Ajay and his lab, they used part of the data to train a machine learning model, and then they used the rest of the data to test that model. If there was a single bold pattern for fear, then the model would identify a single set of brain regions for all 3 varieties of fear. But that is not what they observed. Instead, they observed the human brain can make fear in multiple ways. So let me show you what you're looking at here. One of these images is the cerebral cortex, like here. You're looking at the lateral view, just the outside view. And here you're looking at the medial view. So if I took a brain and I cracked it open like a book, you're looking at the inside of one cerebral hemisphere, one cortical hemisphere. And then what I've done is, which is a common thing that neuroscientists do, is that, you know, the cerebral cortex is kind of, it has like, it has waves. It has like, has sulci and gyri. It's kind of wrinkled. So I just blew it up so it looks like a smooth surface, kind of like a balloon. The dark blue regions here are regions that show an increase in bold signal during any one of the 3 fearful situations. Regions in light blue show an increase in bold signal for any 2 situations, and the red blob showed a signal increase during all 3 situations. So you might be tempted to think, oh, well, the red blob, that's the essence of fear right there. No, actually, that's a really common brain region that shows an increase in activation anytime you're looking at something that moves, like any movement at all. And it's actually part of a well-known network that is intrinsic to the brain that shows an increase in bold signal for a variety, like just a huge number of different psychological events, including memory and perception and so on and so forth. Now, these researchers have gone on since to show that different people show different patterns for the 3 movies. So if I was imaging you, your pattern would not be the same as your pattern, would not be the same as your pattern for any one of these situations, right? There's variation that is meaningful by situation, there's variation that's meaningful by person, and there's variation for each person by situation. But he wouldn't let me show you the last set of results because they're not published yet. So I don't have those to show you, but within a year, they should be available. So emotions are not reactions that are triggered by simple circuits in your brain, even though it feels that way a lot of the time. Our feelings are not a really good guide to how our brain works. So to summarize what I've shown you today, variation is the norm in emotion, in the face, in the body, in the brain. That variation is not random. it is structured by context. And some of that context is found only in your brain as it creates meaning. And in lecture 2, we're going to discuss how your brain creates that meaning, which ultimately gives us some hints about the brain's basic operating principles when creating what we think of as a mind, as a human mind. You will learn that emotions are not built into your brain from birth. They are built by your brain and tailored to specific situations. And that your experience of what is outside your head, in your body and in the world, depends on the signals inside your head. So tomorrow in lecture 2, you'll learn how every action you take, every experience you have is some combination of the sensory present and the remembered past. A past which is relative to the culture that you were raised in and that wired your brain when you were born, or as you acculturated to a new culture if you move. And I'll just remind you that scholars have a special name for the stuff that's outside your head. We call it reality. And that is what we're going to explore in lecture 3. But for today's lecture, I'll just leave you with these 2 takeaways. The emotions that seem to happen to you are actually made by you, automatically outside of your awareness most of the time. And the emotions that you seem to detect in other people partly come from inside your own head. And I will thank you for your attention and take questions. And it worked, no glitches.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I'm sure there are many questions. So to start, great. This will be a challenge. We'll see. Good at catching.
Thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I'm not a cognitive scientist or psychologist. I'm a philosopher, so what do I know? But can you go back to the slide with that kid with the watermelon?
The kid with the watermelon,
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so as I understood your point here is that like this kid seems to be happy, but the facial expression is like is angry. Or in case of your daughter, she is happy, but it seems that she is sad.
No, that's not what I was saying. What I'm saying is that these facial movements are the stereotypes.
Yeah.
Are stereotypes. If you were using the stereotype, you would look at her, well, without the context. So keep in mind that most of the experiments that are done without context. You just show a person a disembodied face that's posed and not moving. And so without the context, parts of the facial movements are the stereotypes of some other of some other expression, right? So like a fear face, what's called a fear face, which just means the stereotype of fear expressions in Western cultures, is actually a threat face in Melanesia. It's a face that you make when you're threatening someone quite deliberately, trying to intimidate them, right? So the point is that the meaning is not in the face. Facial movements vary depending on the situation. Like, why are his eyebrows raised like that? Because he's trying to bite a watermelon that is very large. And there are, muscles are connected to each other. So his eyebrows are raised because he's trying to open his mouth really wide. And actually with most people, when they try to open their eyes really wide, they open their mouth. When they try to open their mouth really wide, they widen their eyes. So my point was just that if you were just to look at the facial movements alone, as you know, hundreds of studies have been done like that, you would make the mistake and think that the person was that the emotional event was something other than what it is.
Yeah, so like that's completely understandable. But what I was thinking of was that what about like a more complex theory of like this expressionist just saying that like, okay, this kid seems to be angry, and if you see it, you see his face, you think he's angry, but maybe he feels anger also when he got his watermelon because, for example, he might wanted to get it, but for some reason he couldn't. Then he developed this anger, and also when he got the watermelon, he already had this anger with him, and also he experienced joy.
Sure, that's possible, but I want you to remember the context in which I presented this. What I said was, I'm going to use an example that summarizes hundreds of experiments.
Yeah.
So yes, if we were just telling a story, we could just tell a story about how really he's angry because the watermelon is too big, he can't fit in his mouth, he really wants it. You could tell a story like that. But I'm not using these pictures to tell you any story. I'm using these pictures to summarize hundreds of experiments that have been done where it's very clear that people move their faces in different ways when they're experiencing instances of what we consider to be the same folk category. So this is just an illustration. I could very painfully walk you through study after study after study, but you know, if this were an academic lecture, you can be sure that we would have seen more data. But you know, this is a public lecture, and so I didn't think people necessarily would have the patience for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And I don't continue, so
okay.
We can talk later.
You can keep it for a while.
Hi, great, thanks a lot. So you reject and presented compelling evidence for rejecting that there are dedicated physical changes in the body for each emotion type, so contra Lang and contra the mistitled Williams-Lang theory. But I guess that's compatible with thinking the following, and I'm wondering whether you also reject it, that there are emotions as a type or have like a dedicated valences. So there's some bodily thing we could say about emotions in general. And more interestingly, I think, or like for my purpose, like dedicated action tendencies. So think of something like guilt. I don't know what's happening, like what the heart rate. Even if we grant, there's no common thing in heart rate, breathing, eye movements. Seems like guilt feels bad. Like it's, painful emotion. Maybe, there'll probably be some variety there. But yeah, I'm wondering whether you want to hold on to those kinds of general claims. And then for the motivational side, like, well, what does guilt motivate? Something we do with our body, but it's kind of individuated at a higher scale than bodily changes. So we make amends, we apologize, we aim to set things right. Maybe we don't always, but we have that motivation, and that's going to take place in the body. So I'm wondering whether, you also are skeptical about those kinds of general claims.
I think they're just made up stories based on Western views. So I think the following. I don't actually have an axe to grind in one way or the other. I'm just really following the evidence. And I'm following the evidence from lots of different studies that are theory-laden in lots of different ways. And I can tell you that when you look for structured variation in a category, even guilt, you find it reliably. But if you design your experiments in such a way that you don't sample, you don't make it possible to observe the variation, you won't. So I think at one time, maybe 20 years ago, I don't know that I would have fallen on my sword for this, but I certainly would have said, I think that valence there's something biologically basic about valence, but there isn't. It's just, there isn't. People can be, happiness can be pleasant and sometimes it can be unpleasant. Anger can be pleasant and sometimes it can be unpleasant. Even guilt. And actually, in our culture, I'll say in my, in U.S. culture, guilt is seen. The stereotype of guilt is unpleasant, but not in all cultures. This is Batya Mesquita's work. So, I think the evidence suggests that variation is structured by context, and that there is no feature, physical or mental, that you can find that is consistent and defining of a folk category. And so my response to questions like yours are the following. If you want to spend your career, if somebody wants to spend their career searching for those patterns, be my guest. But then in 30 years from now, I won't be here, so I won't be able to ask you. But I wouldn't be spending my time on that or my money, because I've looked and they're not there. They're just not. No matter how confident you believe, no matter what kind of stories we spin, they're highly culture-dependent stories. And there's evidence, I guess, is the point. You'd have to discount a lot of evidence, which sometimes people do.
Really interesting. Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks. Next question in the back.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the toned-down version for those of us not in neuroscience. But I was struck by the finding that you showed about the picture of disgust just being something novel. Or something
well, what I was telling you is that we've, I'm not saying it's just something novel. I'm saying the reason why you see so many studies with an increase in amygdala signal is that the images that are being shown when we're trying to cultivate disgust in people are very novel images. So I should point out that in a later version of the statistical summary of all the brain imaging studies, so this was published in 2012, and then we updated the database and published several years later. So this was done in collaboration with Tor Wager's lab. So there were a lot of scientists involved. And one of the things we did was we looked at our scientists using the same kind of strategies, or is there anything reliable about what scientists are doing when they're trying to evoke a particular kind of emotion category? And it turns out there is. So when people are trying to evoke fear, they show certain kinds of images or play certain kinds of movies or that have certain features, or sounds that have certain features. And so the point that I was making here is when scientists are trying to evoke disgust, they're showing people images that they've never seen that are really novel. And that is one explanation for why you see such frequent change in amygdala. Because the amygdala, I mean, the research evidence is one of the things it's doing is it's signaling the rest of the brain when there's something novel or ambiguous that is potentially relevant to your well-being, basically.
Right. Yeah. And so my question was, can you talk a little bit about the role of novelty in emotions? Is that kind of a necessary condition or sort of wrapper for these more fine-grained categories?
Yeah, no, not really. That there is a class of theories called appraisal theories of emotion, which suggests that novelty is a feature of some categories but not others. But again, I would say I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that view. What I will say is that when something is novel or it's ambiguous, you have your brain, there are certain types of changes. If your brain cares if the signals are salient, that is, they matter to you, which they do in an experiment because I'm showing them to you and you're going to be paid, for your participation. There are certain changes that happen. So, for example, if something is novel and salient or it's uncertain, there will be an increase in certain neurochemicals that make it easier for your brain to take in that information and use it. And so what that does basically is in these chemicals, norepinephrine and some other chemicals, but primarily norepinephrine, they make it easier for neurons to fire to learn that new information. And increases in norepinephrine often are associated with increases in heart rate and a general feeling of arousal and jitteriness. So while novelty isn't necessary for emotion, it is the case that when something is novel or uncertain and your brain cares, your brain is making a prediction that this is relevant and needs to be learned so that you can predict better the next time, you will feel it as arousal, which we tend to make sense of as anxiety, although we don't need to. And I'll just give you an example. Does this make sense? Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. Right before the COVID pandemic was announced, I was in New Zealand giving a series of lectures. And my daughter was flying from Boston to New Zealand to meet me because I would always, during spring break, this is the break that universities have and high schools, I would always accept an invitation to speak somewhere interesting and then fly her over, and we would have a little adventure together. So you have to imagine that I'm in a different country. There's news report. If you guys can remember back to that time, right? It was everything was really uncertain. We didn't even know if there was a thing actually happening. I mean, it was just in New Zealand. There was one case of COVID confirmed on the North Island. We were on the South Island, and I'm like, I was very high arousal, and it was very unpleasant. So, a civilian would experience that as anxiety. But I called my husband and I said, I'm feeling very unpleasant because I'm having very high arousal. I'm very uncertain about what to do. And having been married to me for a long time, he didn't say, like, what is this psychological mumbo jumbo bullshit? No, he said, oh, okay, let's talk it through. And, so my point is that tomorrow we're going to talk about how when your brain is making meaning, the first thing it's doing is actually making a plan for action. And so if you experience this increase in arousal that comes with novelty and uncertainty, if you experience it as anxiety, you'll do one set of things. If you experience it as mere uncertainty, you will search for information and you will do something different. So arousal is not emotion. It's just it's a simple feeling. Again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. That tends to come with novelty and uncertainty. But emotions don't have to be high in arousal. You don't have to experience that gush of arousal in order to be emotional. In fact, most of the time you don't, actually. That was a long-winded answer, and just to let you know, I'll answer your question in a second. We stayed in New Zealand for 3 days. And we were we were actually at the airport to fly to the North Island to spend 4 or 5 days there and then fly home. And when we got to the airport, London impounded its first plane full of hundreds of people and quarantined them for 2 weeks. And so in the air, rebooked our ticket. We flew home, and the borders closed. I think it was 2 days later. It was very uncertain time.
I think there's another question in the back first.
Oh, in the back? Okay.
Thanks. So when you showed the picture of your daughter's eyes, my first thought was that this person was tired. Do you have a view about those kinds of feelings that we more naturally associate with physiological kind of states? So on the one hand, do they have... do you think they also don't have any unique expressions and any unique brain goings on?
Yeah, so I'll say all feelings are associated with physiological changes. Yeah. So that's the first point, right? And I think I want to say it mostly they're not obligatory, but there are some exceptions. Okay, so for example, when you are dehydrated, do you feel thirsty?
I guess so, yeah.
Well, no, actually.
Okay.
If you're moderately low on hydration, you'll feel thirsty. If you're really dehydrated, you will feel tired. Most people feel, especially in the US, where people drink a shit ton of coffee. That used to be me. So now I drink a shit ton of tea, but not coffee anymore. But what happens is you're drinking a lot of coffee in the morning, and then by the afternoon, you're really dehydrated. You feel really tired. So what do? You drink more coffee. But actually, one way to ward off the sort of dip in the middle of the afternoon is to drink a lot of water in the morning, and then you don't really have it in the afternoon. So I guess my point is that even like every mental feature that you experience has a physiological basis, but the mental features you experience are not always mapping one-to-one to the physiological basis. That being said, I think that there are some signals in certain contexts that are probably diagnostic. Like if you're behind the wheel of a car and your eyelids are closing or your head is jerking, probably there's a high likelihood that you're falling asleep. And if that's not universal, it's really common, right? There aren't a lot of other reasons why your eyelids would close when you're behind the wheel. But this is a really specific situation that you're in. Is it the case that your eyelids always, when your eyelids close, that you're sleepy or falling asleep? No, in fact, videotape yourself. I have a lot of people have videotaped talks for me for now like 7 years. And there are some movements that I make with my eyes. I'm like, wow, holy shit. Like I had no idea that I did that. And one of them has to do with like looking up and like closing my eyes in a particular, yeah, I mean like it's really, and I had no, so my answer to you is under certain circumstances, highly constrained situations, probably some physical movements are diagnostic. But as a general rule, the features of experience are not mapped one-to-one to the physiological basis of those features. That's just the evidence. Like, I don't have like my position is just it's just an empirical position. Yeah.
Thanks.
One question in the middle, and I have seen both of you, so I will do eventually, please.
My question is about the multiple realizability. And my question is, what's so special about emotions here?
Nothing.
If you look at an object, there's a glass behind you on the table. If different people look at the glass and you brain scan them, will you have a persistent pattern between persons?
So, yeah.
That's question A, between persons.
Yeah.
Will you, for the same person, have different patterns between times?
That is an excellent question. And here's the answer, to the best of my knowledge. If you were showing an image like this in 3 dimensions and you were scanning people's brains, if you looked in primary visual cortex, so this is at the back of the brain, this is the place where neurons come from, they go from your retina to the thalamus to primary visual cortex, most of them. There are some that go through another subcortical area, but most people who are have neurotypical retina and a neurotypical brain will show the same pattern when looking at this glass, more or less. But what you plan to do with this glass, what function it serves for you, will be manifest as different signals further forward in the brain. So this glass can be a vessel to drink from, or it can be a pencil holder, or it could be a plant holder, or I suppose if it was a glass, it could be a weapon. right? What you plan to do with the glass, the function the glass serves for you, will manifest as different patterns. And there are studies that, so for example, if I show you the glass and I say, okay, look at this glass as a vessel to drink water from. Look at this glass as a weapon to throw at someone's head. Look at this glass. If I give you those kinds of instructions, then the patterns elsewhere in the brain change. Now, but here's what changes in V1, in primary visual cortex. If I place this glass in front of you and I say, look at it, there are different patterns in primary visual cortex than if I place the glass over here and you have to move your eyes over here. Your movement of your eyes changes in primary visual cortex. I can also give you instructions that change the size of receptive fields in the neurons in V1. So what I'm trying to, primary visual cortex, so what I'm trying to say is that most people who are neurotypical will, if you give them the same instruction, will show, some parts of the brain will show very similar patterns, but if you look at the whole brain together, like a whole pattern for the brain, you see differences across people depending on the context, right? So normally when I show you a glass, I don't give you a context, but you have one and I'm not measuring it. If I control it, then we see that there are patterns that are determined by the context. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. Now, your other question is super great question. And that is, if I show you this at time 1 and I say, look at this as a weapon to throw at someone's head. And then at time 2, I say, look at this as a weapon and to throw at someone's head. If you summarize across instances, those instances for one person, you can find something in common for both of those instances. But if you looked at the whole pattern, would they be identical? No, they would not be identical. Because in psychology, the way these studies are designed, the assumption is that your brain is off until I show you the image, and then the image triggers or stimulates your neurons. That is not how your brain is working. Your brain is always controlling your body. It's fluctuating. And so when I show you the image, there's already a temporal context there that your brain is taking account of. So 2 trials where I show you the image with the exact same instructions are actually not the same because your physical state is different. And maybe what I showed you on the prior trial is different. And your brain has a spatial and a temporal context. So if we take account of those contextual variation, if we design studies where we try to reliably model that variation, we can do it. It's just most of the time studies aren't designed that way. They're looking for what is the same across trials. And they can find something that's the same by aggregating a lot of signal in a person across people. So basically, to answer your question, I'm trying to answer it without appealing to dynamical systems language here. Strong representational views that there's a set of neurons that represents an image stably over and over again are probably not correct. Experiments that are designed to look for variation and model reliable variation find it. So when you are looking at an image, you're not just looking at an image, you're looking at an image with a function in mind. It might not seem that way to you, but you are. And if you modify that function, if you vary it, you can see evidence of it. That was a very long-winded way. I should have just said no, there's no stability. But it's just more interesting and more complicated than that. I don't know. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks. I think you're next.
I'm interested in Charles Darwin. Did he actually use the word Lamarckian?
Yeah, he does refer to Lamarck by name.
Okay.
In the expression of the emotions in men and animals, he does refer to Lamarck by name. I don't think he said Lamarckian evolution, but he refers to Lamarck. He also is very clearly describing, I can't remember if it's his first principle or second principle, but he's very clearly describing what we understand to be Lamarckian evolution. Where Lamarckian, does everyone know what Lamarckian evolution is? No. Lamarckian evolution is where if
giraffes get a very long throat by stretching for leaves up on the
basically
trees.
You acquire a behavior, and if it's useful, you actually pass that behavior. It becomes encoded in, and you pass it on to the next generation, basically. And there actually is some evidence that some things actually do look a little Lamarckian in how features are transmitted across generations. But the point is that Darwin didn't have that much of an interest in emotion. He had an interest in demonstrating that natural selection, that evolution, that humans were subject to evolution. And that's really what that book is for. Yeah. And my more general point is just we have to stop reading historical works as if they are ahistorical. Like, people cite things to me that I wrote 20 years ago as if I wrote them today. I've changed my mind on a whole bunch of stuff, valence being one of them, on the basis of evidence. So read in historical context is really was what I was trying to say there.
A small remark. The Swedish authority handling safety on roads and trying to stop collisions between mammals and cars. They found that European moose, were just afraid of one scent. All other scents were sort of ignored when it comes to crossing the road or not. And that scent was Siberian tiger. So there are evolution. The Swedish moose has been a part of a larger gene pool of mooses in Europe and Asia and Siberia. But those mooses, they've met the big predator.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, there is some evidence that some features appear to be transmitted across generations in a Lamarckian way, which is what I said. And
this one is presumably a Mendelian way.
Either way, the point being that, I mean, we could talk about whether or not, the moose is actually afraid, but I think we should talk about that on Wednesday. That's where I think that's more relevant there. But either way, my point is that people use Darwin as evidence that something is true. If Darwin said it, it must be true. Darwin was a great scholar, but all great scholars are wrong about something. That was my point. The number of papers you could count. The number of papers which start by claiming that facial expressions have to be universal because Darwin said so. And I wish that was, I wish that I was being facetious or this was hyperbole, but it isn't.
Thank you for your talk. It was super amazing. My question regards so I want to know what kind of relation you're denying in your three theses regarding facial expression, body, and brain. Whether it's you're denying the necessary and sufficient condition, causality, correlation, or deduction. So let me explain what I mean by this by referring to an anecdote. So I went to a therapist, and then I don't know how to feel anger. So my therapist told me, so imagine a situation where you would feel anger, and then I was like, all right, I'm imagining it, and then she's like, can you feel your heartbeat raise? I'm like, yeah, a little bit, and then she's like, can you feel your temperature raised? And I'm like, yeah, I feel a little bit of temper raising as well when and then she's like, well, that's anger, and I think there's something to it, right? Because when I feel anger, it seems like some kind of bodily signal is there, but according to your talk, it seems like. And I totally buy that. Just by looking at bodily functions like raised heartbeat or temperature raising, you cannot deduce whether you're surprised or you're happy. Fine. So I'm interested to know what kind of relation you're denying here. So I can see that sometimes you say you cannot deduce that someone's angry or happy just by looking at their eyebrows or eyes. And sometimes you say, well, sometimes feeling anger, it doesn't cause certain kind of brain activity. Or you sometimes say, well, there's no correlation between facial expression and emotions. So there are different kinds of relations that you're denying, whether it's deduction, correlation, causality, or necessary and sufficient condition. And I think that's what you're denying for sure. You can say, well, the facial expression, scowling, is anger if and only if your eyebrows are this way. And you're certainly denying that. But I'm also interested in knowing whether it's more than that. Is it causal? Is it from anger to facial expressions, or from facial expressions to anger, or are you even denying correlation? And I think you're also denying deduction. You cannot deduce that since a person has this kind of facial expression, you cannot deduce that this person is happy.
So I would say I would use different words than you use, right? So what you're calling deduction, I would call perception. You're experiencing somebody as anger, you're experiencing somebody as fearful or whatever. But I guess to answer your question, what I would say is there are no necessary and sufficient features for any category. Anger, sadness, fear, those are folk categories, and they are populations of variable instances. The variation isn't random, it's structured by the situation. So what I'm saying is that you may have been taught to make sense of your physical sensations in a stereotypic way, and that probably helps you communicate with other people or maybe know what to do in certain situations. But it is a stereotype because the evidence suggests that, first of all, every experience you ever have has a set of physical signals in your body that have changed. Emotions don't cause things to happen in the brain. Emotions manifest because there are changes in the brain, making sense of changes in the body in relation to, right? So tomorrow I'm going to talk about, I think it's tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? I think it's tomorrow. I'm going to talk about that. Your brain is constant, your body is filled with sensory surfaces. You have retinas to take in signals from the world. You have cochlea in each ear, take in signals from the world. You also have sensory surfaces inside your body reporting to your brain on how much glucose you're metabolizing, how much oxygen is in your blood, all kinds of signals, thousands of them constantly streaming to your brain. Your brain has to figure out what those patterns mean to plan action in the next moment. And what I'm telling you is that there is something meaningful and reliable going on, but it is not well organized by folk categories. So if you measure people, you can see that their facial movements vary in different instances of anger. there are changes in heart rate, changes in breathing, changes in cortisol levels, changes in dopamine in the brain. They all vary in different instances of anger. Sometimes mental features differ. People can feel pleasant in anger, they can feel unpleasant in anger. They can feel worked up in anger, they can feel calm in anger, cool in anger. It's not random, but it's a population of variable instances. In On the Origin of Species, Darwin, one of the great innovations that Darwin introduced into biology was the idea that a biological category is not a type. It's a category of variable instances, right? So a species, there's no type. There's no it's like the dog show version of a species. It's just like there's no perfect dog. There's no perfect Cocker Spaniel. That's a stereotype. What's real is the variation, and the variation is situated. So there's a relational aspect to the variation that is where the meaning lives. And that's what I'm saying. The emotions work exactly the same way. In fact, every category works like that, I will actually say. Every category works that way. So what I'm saying is, yes, you can't just look at when you look at someone's face and what you're calling is deduction, I would say, well, you're making an inference. I don't know if it's a deductive inference, but you're certainly making an inference. That inference is influenced by what just happened. It's influenced by spatially what's happening. It's influenced by what's happening in your body. I can actually change signals in someone's body without their awareness, and it will influence how they literally see somebody else's face. Like literally what they see. Because your brain is tracking more signals than it makes itself aware of. And so obviously there's something predictable going on because we can communicate with each other, right? But that doesn't mean that there's a fixed set of features, like an essence, or even like a property cluster that is highly probable. All indications are that that's not how it works, and there's great variation there, but brains are creating meaning out of that variation. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, part of what we do in therapy is we teach people, we acculturate them to the stereotypic meanings. I was a therapist once in a previous life. That's partly what we do. And I have a lot more to say about that, but I'll just stop there. Thank you for that question, though.
So, you're next.
Okay, hi, Lisa. Here.
Hi.
So back to the William James instance of emotion being dependent on physical manifestation, and what I agree with is a misquote that is the foundation of a lot. I think I know the answer to the question I'm about to ask you, but I need to hear it from you. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Damasio's work is basically just an extension on this misinterpretation?
Yes. So I think Damasio put his finger on something super important actually. And that is, I think he was actually trained. And you know what? I'm not sure if he was trained, but there's this neurologist, whose first name I can't remember, but his last name is Nauta, N-A-U-T-A. He was very, very influential, and he had a view that was held by a number of neurologists and neuroanatomists that that parts of the brain that we think of as being important for thinking and so on are actually important for regulating the body. Okay? Mm-hmm. This was Nauta's view. And Damasio took his cue in part from that work, which I think is exactly right. Yeah. But he went further than that. And his somatic marker hypothesis is I wouldn't say it's Jamesian, I would say it's like Carl Lange. It's the Langian view. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that view, right? So if he gave up this idea that there were, there was one prototypic pattern for each folk category, his view would probably, in my view, his view would be more tenable. So I think there's a lot to like about his view. I just think that the somatic marker piece, emotions don't live in your body. They just don't. I don't know if in the United States there's a book, what's it called? The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Yeah. The body doesn't keep the score. Your brain keeps the score. Your body is the scorecard. Your body is the scorecard. Usually I say brain, body doesn't have a memory. And then somebody else will say, well, your immune system has a memory. Yeah, well, I suppose sort of. You could say metaphorically your immune system. In invertebrates, immune systems learn. And so they're adaptable. And so I guess you could say that has a memory. But that's about as far as, it's very metaphorical, and that's about as far as it goes.
I think that is a very interesting example, though, because isn't PTSD actually the evidence that anger can manifest or be kept hidden, hence manifesting in a different way than anger?
What I would say is that PTSD is a problem of prediction. It's a problem of prediction in the brain.
So you see the opposite. Instead of expression of the anger or the sadness or whatever, it's kept hidden. So it's presented in a different way and is interpreted by the clinical view as a problem.
But I think the important thing that I'm pointing out here is that your brain's, I'm giving away, I don't even have to give the talk tomorrow now. So. Your brain's, your brain's most important job is regulating your body. And there will be peripheral changes in your body if your brain continually sends certain types of signals. Okay, so there is a constant communication between the signals in here and the signals up here. And so I think that's the part that Damasio got right. But you don't feel anything in your body. You don't feel anything in your body. Everything you feel is in your brain. Everything you experience, every mental feature is in your brain, right? If you pinch yourself, where do you feel that? Do you feel it here? No, you don't. You feel it here. Actually, to be precise, you feel it somewhere around here. Actually, this side's out here, somewhere like right there, right? When you see, do you see in your eyes? No. You need your eyes. Although tomorrow I will show you, you don't really need your eyes. Was it tomorrow? Yeah, yeah, it's tomorrow. I will show you. You don't always need your eyes to see. But you need, light strikes your retina. Is that important? Sure, that's important. But you see in your brain. When you feel your heartbeat, you feel it in your brain. You don't feel anything in your body. You are feeling in your brain. And one of the mysteries of consciousness is how is it that we experience things in the brain, but yet it feels to us, the brain is creating these experiences as if the features are in here and out here, but none of them are. They're all in here. And I think this is the thing that Damasio gets wrong, actually.
The physiological fingerprints.
Yeah, and feelings, there are no feeling. You don't feel things in your body. You feel things in your brain. I think he knows that. He's a great neurologist, so I think he knows that. It may just be a misdescription of his work.
Thank you.
Thanks. You're next.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And you already touched upon the following question in your response to Johan's question, but perhaps you could say a few more things about it. So you mentioned that facial expressions, emotional facial expressions, are not random, but they are like structured, some sort of structured variation. You mentioned, right? And I was wondering if you could perhaps say, like, in what sense it is structured? Is it contextually? Is it like biological features, or what do you have in mind here?
I guess what I have in mind is you don't move your face randomly. If you did, so there are people who move their faces randomly. For example, people with schizophrenia move their faces randomly, and we notice that. and we think it's odd. Because why would we look at someone who's schizophrenic and someone who's suffering from schizophrenia and think that it's odd? Because somehow we must have there must be statistical regularities in the way that people are moving their faces, right? That doesn't mean that you move your face in one way during anger and one way during fear, right? So, for example, there are times when just by the look on my face, just by the movements I've made, let me back up. No, I will say it this. Just by the movements I've made, my husband looks at me and he says, "You're starting to get a migraine." And he's right. And I wasn't even aware. But it's because I'm doing something with my face that it's a signal that is my signal, not a signal of migraine that everybody has because the signal is endowed in the meaning is endowed in the signal. That's my pattern, right? So when we study individual people, like we've done this with physiological patterns, for example, and we're getting ready to do it with facial movements. It's just harder measurement-wise to do. But when we do it with physiological patterns, what we find is that people have reliable patterns in the measurable signals of their physiology. They're reliable, but you might have 3 and I might have 8 and Dita here might have 12, and there's a many-to-many pattern, a many-to-many relationship, meaning your 3, you know, the mental features that go with those are not always the same. That is, you know, anger and sadness and fear might go with all 3. And what we find is that some of the patterns are repeatable in people, but not in everybody. Right? So about 2/3 of the patterns that we were able to identify reliably using unsupervised machine learning, about 2/3 of them are present in more than one person, but there's no pattern that was present in everybody. Now, of course, we were only measuring something like 6 or 7 signals because that was all we could measure at the time. But all indications are that if you measure more signals, you just find more reliable patterns. You don't find fewer. So what I'm trying to say here is that I'm not saying that every person responds differently in every single situation. I'm saying that you yourself, if we just studied you over time and we measured everything we could, every signal that we could get, and we used all kinds of, maybe used representational learning, some kind of very sophisticated, you know, self-supervised, partially, you know, machine learning, I'm sure we could find patterns in you. But I don't think we'll find one anger pattern and one sadness pattern. And all indications are maybe we'll find 4 patterns for anger in you and 8 patterns for sadness and 12 patterns for happiness. And maybe I have 12 patterns for anger and 2 patterns for happiness. I don't know, but you get the point. Variation is structured by the meaning of any signal is structured by its relation to other signals. So in the brain, for example, you look at a given neuron, a single neuron, you can't say that that neuron has a function. That neuron's function is defined by its relation to some other neuron. Because a single neuron can send an axon, a signal, to one neuron and it's a motor signal, to another neuron and it's a visual signal, to another neuron and it's an auditory signal. The relationship, the meaning of the signal is in the relation between the neurons. This is true for every neuron in the brain, every single neuron, right? The meaning is relational. So there's structure in the relations in the signal ensembles. That's the punchline, basically. So now you don't have to come for the rest of the lecture.
It's a good punchline, but if I can follow up on that, so
maybe we have to go on because we have very little time and already 2 people queuing up.
And I'm not, you know, you gathered by now that brevity is not my strong suit.
I'm happy with the punchline.
Just come back tomorrow. So you're next. So we have two more people asking questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation today. So I come from developmental psychology and also emotional development and attachment theory. And so we have been looking for the generalization process Imagine what you've done to my brain today.
Sorry.
Yes. But I'm thinking...
but you'll like tomorrow, I think.
I liked today as well, yes. Thank you. But I'm thinking like this, then if we would repeat everything, but we would repeat it with the family as a unit, not the individual, or if we would be looking for the patterns of recognition of others' emotions in close others, in interactions, then we would probably be able to have more than 30% or the 60%.
I think that I agree with you, but I don't think there's going to be a one to. So what I would say there is, I would say that, first of all, I wouldn't say, I would be really careful with the word recognition. So I would probably talk about synchrony, maybe, not so much recognition. That just has implications about with traditional realism that I don't particularly favor. But what I would say to you is, yes, I agree that that's true. But I think what you would see is that in order to get to those higher levels of agreement, you would have to model more than one communicative pattern. So I don't think there's going to be one pattern, even in a family, for anger. I really don't think that's what the evidence suggests. And more importantly, what I would say is, as a scientist, you should be designing your experiments to look for structured variation, because if there is sameness, you can discover it. However, if you assume that sameness is there, and that's how you do your experiments, you will never discover. The only thing you can discover is randomness. You can never discover structured variation. So, I just point you to the way that people have done studies in infants in emotional development, and you see my point.
Yes. So what I thought of doing, if allowed, is to ask you in a more applied way, given all that you are convinced about, and maybe many of us here also are convinced about, where are we with training, understanding and compassion in the multicultural, multi-level social groups that our societies comprise today? What should we be taking as a message for implementation to strengthen the capacity of everybody for more openness and understanding of others?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say about this. I'll just try to keep it brief. No, you laugh, I know, because that's not possible. First of all, I'll say go look at work by Batya Mesquita, who is a cross-cultural. She does cultural work in emotion, and she just wrote this really great book called Between Us. I knew I was going to get... And she actually addresses this point. But what I would say more generally is, in an applied setting, I think it's very important to be curious and open, as opposed to, because you risk cultural imperialism. You really do, and it's not helpful to people. It's not going to help them in any way. So when you move to a new culture, and that movement can be physically, you've moved your family, or it could mean you go from home to work, right? Or you go from one office to another. I mean, cultures are not necessarily geographic boundaries. You have to know the concepts and meanings in that cultural setting. Otherwise, you can't communicate with people. But I think the idea that there is universality it's not just scientifically problematic. It's not just completely disrespectful to the agency of people. It's also really harmful physically. Will it be harmful, for health-wise? So I think we have to. I mean, honestly, the situation we're in is we don't know enough, other than to be curious and to ask questions and to learn. And when we're teaching someone a stereotype, we should tell them it's a stereotype. Stereotypes are sometimes useful. If I know nothing about you, I've just met you for the first time and you're speaking English to me, then if you scowl, I'm going to make a guess that you're angry. And then you might say, no, I'm not angry. I'm just concentrating. And then I'll be like, oh, okay. What you don't want is someone saying, no, you are angry. You just don't know it. That's totally disrespectful. Totally disrespectful. And it ignores the reality that that person is living. And I mean that very seriously. So, yeah. But look at Bache Mesquita's work. It's so good.
Okay, thank you. It's 5 o'clock, and I happen to know that everyone's brains turn off at exactly 5. So let's thank this again. And
thank you.